Hello, everybody. You can call me Dr. Vieve, actually. But my full name is Genevieve Guenther, and I'm the founding director of End Climate Silence, which is an advocacy group trying to push the news media to cover climate with the urgency and the accuracy that it deserves as an element in every story we tell, not a siloed climate and environment story. And I'm also the author of The Language of Climate Politics, Fossil Fuel Propaganda and How to Fight It, which I totally forgot to leave. Oh my gosh, wow. That was like a peak moment in life. Thank you so much. It will be on the reading corner tomorrow. I totally forgot to bring it today. I also consult with US policymakers on climate disinformation and communication. So I took this question for the panel extremely literally and very seriously, and I'd like to answer yes. The climate movement has overlooked culture. Yet, culture, especially now, is our most important lever for creating change. Historically, the climate movement has had roughly two models for how to create systemic change. The first is by tugging on economic levers, such as risk perception, innovation, pricing, or trade agreements, which can be marshaled to try to get capital to produce a green transition on the basis of the profit motive. Or two, nonviolent collective direct action that seeks the passage of national legislation and international cooperation that would force the green transition. Now, I personally think that the economic levers are getting stuck on the risk of multi-trillions of stranded fossil capital, as well as the exposure of the equities and credit markets to the ripple effect of that devaluation. I think also that the theater of nonviolent direct action has been dismantled in the development of the tech platforms that form and shape public attention and create the new historical era of techno-authoritarianism in which we now live. This has given us a fragmented media sphere shot through with disinformation, as well as extreme economic inequality, which together prevent the formation of any sustained consensus in our imagined communities, however you want to define them, usually on the national level, but also perhaps even locally, and certainly internationally. So that leaves interventions into culture. And I think the people in this room might say that's probably where we should have started, because the cliche is actually true, which is tragic for me as a writer when cliches are true, but the cliche is true that politics is downstream of culture. And economics is itself culture. Dollar bills, for example, are mere symbols printed on pieces of paper which we all agree to treat as the most real thing on this planet. That makes culture the intersection of the ideological and the material, the personal and the social, the local and the collective, the nexus of the past, the present, and the future. Culture is thus at the center of the production and reproduction of power, of the structures, material and ideational, of domination, the structures of domination that, at least for now, are creating and accelerating the climate and ecological crises. That is to say, in my diagnosis at least, our current culture actually delimits our agency so that our economy, despite ourselves, keeps destroying our planetary future. Yet, of course, this is not a hopeless state of affairs because culture is not permanent. It is malleable. To be human in ancient Egypt is very different than being human today, than being human in the 19th century, than being human in an indigenous culture in the Amazon, than being human in Beijing. All of these are socially produced realities which can be made and remade through human agency. There are local folk and especially indigenous cultures that have the deep wisdom to live in consort with planetary systems. And the time is now for us to use institutions and spaces like this to put those indigenous cultures at the head of the table and to listen and learn from them deeply. And the time is now also and equally to use culture as the aesthetic to create change. So my background is actually in Renaissance literature, not in science. And in the Renaissance, people thought literature was actually an elevated form of propaganda or even magic that would, through beauty, through envisioning the ideal, transform your political disposition without your even knowing it was being so transformed. This is what we mean by culture when we talk about culture's power to create change. Storytelling, art making, fantasy, techno-hacking, ritual, beauty, imagination. The Marxist philosopher Theodor Adorno writes that, quote, artworks detach themselves from the empirical world and bring forth another world, one opposed to the empirical world as if this other world, too, were an autonomous entity. And on autonomy, that new world conjured forth in the artwork by culture has powerful political potential. I want to end by invoking the classical myth of Orpheus, not the man who failed to get his wife back from the dead because he couldn't control his desire to look at her, but the great artist who managed to make animals, plants, and even stones themselves bend to the extraordinary beauty of the music of his harp. Our job is to make the infrastructure producing the climate and ecological crisis bend towards a new future. And I look forward to this panel as an initial thought, an initial intervention to help us do that. And our first speaker today is Lucy Stone. Lucy is the founder of Climate Spring, the global organization funding and supporting scripted and unscripted storytelling that changes the way society sees the climate crisis. Climate Spring works with stakeholders in the industry as a funder, advisor, convener, and facilitator, which makes Lucy a leading narrative change expert and climate innovator who has set up many successful organizations and initiatives and advised UN organizations and governments. Lucy, please take it away.
Thank you so much, and what a beautiful opening. So, just a word on why I set up Climate Spring, which is then an introduction to how I see this question and the conversation we're going to have today. I actually also started in the arts. This is a theme. There's one of my favorite memes in the climate space is asking who in the climate space used to be an artist. A lot of people left the world of creativity to go into the climate space, feeling that's what they had to do. And I think what we're seeing now is a kind of return. So having worked, yes, in the climate space, in politics and campaigning and NGO and UN organizations, increasingly it became obvious that we're in a cultural space, we're in a contested cultural ground. And until we grapple with that and really understand what that means, we're always on the back foot. So yes, that is why I founded this organization. And we're really part of this very fast-growing ecosystem, a mycelial network, if you like, of many creatives and producers, commissioners, broadcasters from globally, really trying to grapple with what this means. And I just wanted to take a moment to talk about what do we mean by culture. The actual etymology of the word culture, what it actually means, is from the Latin word. Who knows this already? Does anyone know the actual meaning of culture is to cultivate the soil in preparation for growing? And it couldn't be more of an appropriate metaphor, as Ella talked about this morning, how we're cultivating the soil for the world that we need to cultivate, the ways of being we need to cultivate. And so culture often set up Climate Spring, having worked a lot with philanthropy, and trying to do exactly in Climate Spring, trying to do what the Alliance Foundation talked about, is sort of bringing together culture as a strategy with the change that's trying to be brought in the system that we're trying to bring about. And really that's understanding that culture is not just decoration, it's not just the kind of backdrop of our human story. Of course it's not. Culture is our meaning, our place of meaning making. It always has been and it always will be. And yes, it gets hijacked and it is always being contested. But what we, I think, often forget is culture is not just art, it's not just our storytelling and our art and our music and our stories. Culture is our social enactment, it's our rituals, it's our coming together, it's sport, football, World Cup, it's also religion, and whatever form religion that takes. And that is because culture is our collective understanding of what it means to be human, not just our individual understanding. And of course, what needs to shift there is our understanding of what it means to be in relationship with each other and how do we live in a flourishing of the beauty, of the privilege of being alive at a time when we can reconnect to being within the flourishing of the planetary boundaries rather than the limits of planetary boundaries. And so the two things I wanted to say is, firstly, one of the things we do at Climate Spring is, as well as we kind of cultivate a whole kind of network of stories across different mediums and platforms, we're sort of the mother tree, if you like, in the forest, trying to send the nutrients to all these other stories trying to be created. And what we find artists come back to again and again, and producers and the commissioners, is thinking about how the stories are upholding the status quo. And that is something that most people don't think about. And that's a real power that you can give people, is to think about how are you unintentionally maintaining the harmful status quo. And that's often without realizing it. The extractivism, we all do that. You know, we've all, had our imaginations captured by the fossil fuel industry. We've had our imaginations captured by this narrative of extractivism. But it's not who we are, and it's not what we feel. And the science, as we heard yesterday from the opening talks, the science is showing us that is literally not the case anymore, and we're feeling it. And I think that's where culture is already starting to shift. It's trying to be throttled by the status quo, but it is where culture is shifting. There is huge pushback. We're seeing popular culture pushback by younger generations who are wanting to get offline. They're wanting to reconnect. And that's not a coincidence. It's what we're feeling drawn to. So in a way, what all we see our role at Climate Spring is doing is just trying to remove that blocker, if you like, and release all of the creativity that really frees our imaginations to where we really need to be. And the last thing just to say is, so that's how culture can uphold and release the narratives and the ways of being, the mindsets that are holding up the status quo. And of course, it's obvious but worth reminding, that is why culture becomes the battleground. It's why it is the battleground at the moment. Because if you can shift that, you're shifting the very underpinning of everything. It's why our media platforms are being bought out. It's why there is so much money pouring into trying to control our cultural narratives. And I am optimistic because I feel like no matter how much money the trillionaires might try to chuck into the culture space because they want to own it, they're not going to win, because most creatives, most artists, most producers, anyone working in the culture space, anyone who's living in culture, which is, everybody, does not want to be the arm of propaganda for the extractive system. They really don't. And when you give them that permission and you give that lens, you are liberating everyone to think very differently. And so it's really thinking about everybody as artists and everybody playing a narrative change role, whether that is your practice or not. Everybody has that permission. And I think I'm running out of time, aren't I? Okay, so I'll end on that. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Sorry, terrible timekeeping.
That was fantastic, and I see a theme emerging, maybe, about how culture is a mode of reproducing structures of domination. We'll see what Ada says. Our second speaker is Ada Parris, futurist, artist, author, leadership advisor, and researcher. Ada's work is practice-led, body-first, and rooted in indigenous, global majority, and other epistemologies. The gap between ecological awareness, she knows, and action is not an information problem, it's a listening problem. And I can't wait to listen to you today.
Thank you. On? It's on? Oh, hello. Wow, thank you, first of all, for having me here. I wrote a presentation, however, many of the conversations I've had and some of the talks that have been shared already have really already influenced what I think I want to say. So I've got some notes, I've got a deck, but I may change. And even with the conversations we've just had in our group, it's influenced a lot of that. So thank you for what you said. The etymology of culture is earth. One of the last things I discovered when I was writing my book is that the etymology of the word humility, humus, is earth. And we seem to have forgotten that. And so that's kind of the lens that I'm going to take here. So the question, in tackling the ecological crisis, have we overlooked culture? And initially when we had our discussion, I was like, yes. But we are asking questions of the wrong culture. And actually, what I've come to is that we've become reductionist with the word culture. And we are asking culture, that definition of culture, to do something it's not capable of doing on its own. Because what has happened is somehow, and when I say we, I hate the terms global north and global south. I don't like them. But there is something about the we that has extracted and colonized and taken out the culture of the ancestry, of the indigenous. And we cannot define culture, we cannot define problems without having those indigenous knowledges, wisdoms, everything defining the problem together. We're not an afterthought. We're not research. We're not supposed to be this research that comes after or included later. So we've been asking it to do something it is not capable of doing, and yet we still recreate the work, and we do create beautiful works of art. But to me, I'm really into maps. Really into maps. And to me, this is a cartography problem. Because soil and DNA existed before somebody came up with a ruler and decided to draw boundaries around things. And that's what we've done with the term culture and the idea of it. So having a conversation about culture, we're really having a conversation about cartography and about boundaries. And no matter the beauty of the work, and this is not a criticism of the work because there is many beautiful work, but we can't solve the problem by telling beautiful stories when the boundaries are still there. It's like the conversation of we need to have more people at the table. Well, the table is still bound by rules and regulations, and you're asking me to minimize myself to be around a table that doesn't really want me. And so we have to understand that this is multidimensional, multi-generational, and so it means that all of us have to look at ourselves. And I said to you, part of the work, and I'm in this transition from this world of futurism to storytelling, and part of that has been to sit in the liminal spaces with the discomfort. And there's three things for me. It's power dynamics. Whose voice is at the table? Who's invited? Right now we're all here. We're very privileged to be here and to recognize that as a power dynamic as well. The second is paradoxes, that multiple things can be true at the same time. And we've got into a world where it's this or that, it's left or right, it's male or female, all of these things. We're still trying to push things down into this narrow lens of what culture is. And we need to be more expansive because that's our egos that are pushing those things. And the last P is presence. And yes, we can sit up atop of a mountain and meditate, but presence is really holding the mirror up to ourselves and eye-gazing with ourselves and recognizing that we are part of the problem and the solution. So, and this is where digital technology comes in because it amplifies the consciousness of those who created it. It's the same with the way that we're having these discussions about culture. And whether intentional or not, that's what's happening. So then to ask, are we overlooking culture? We're asking, are we overlooking something that we've created? And we're still maintaining these boundaries around it. Because now we're in this world, ChatGPT, AI, all of these things, and we're asking these things, we're asking these platforms these questions, taking the answers and speeding ahead. One of the things that I'm doing now is slowing down and saying, how does that answer really hit me? Where does it hit me in my stomach, in my body? How do I feel about what I've just been given? And what am I going to do with that feeling rather than rushing ahead? And I think that's the conversation I want to have around culture. Oh, I said this. Because we're not alone. Every single one of us in this room has ancestral culture, has ancestral lineage. I was born in Southeast London, if you didn't get the accent. To a Nigerian Igbo father, so all Igbo first daughters are called Ada, all of us. It's a lineage. It is a legacy. It is a blockchain. My mother, Guyanese, Amerindian, but I've been tracing my ancestry. Fascinating. Bantu migration, but really my earliest ancestors are Coptic, Egyptian, and Ashkenazi Jewish. And I have this map of understanding who I am. The one that's recently come up is Mongolian. All of these things. So now what happens is when I step into a new country where I know I have ancestry, I see that as home. So my project, the conversations that I'm having, is about cartography is not home. The boundaries that we put around the definition of understanding of culture is not home. And yet we're still trying to solve problems and create works of art. This is actually one of my pieces of work. Have I got a minute to say what it is?
You do, my dear.
Okay. So, little story, because I think it will be relevant. William Gladstone, ex-Prime Minister, the UK, apparently very liberal, blah, blah, blah. I know the family, and I was working with them to do an open call for one of his works of art. They wanted somebody to produce a work of art to go in his Temple of Peace. Through the research, I discovered that Gladstone's father owned slave plantations where my mother was from. So then I decided, well, your family, I'm now sitting in the castle that was built on the back of my family. So I decided that I am going to create a work of art to have that as a discussion. What I did is I found a map from 1899, the year after Gladstone was died. My question that I've been asking, so Anna, where are you? The question that you ask is very similar to the one that I've been asking since 2019. What type of ancestor do you want to be? What type of ancestor do I want to be? Wrote that on the map. You can see some gold thread. What I did is I looked at Gladstone's policies that impacted the migration of my family. And that became a conversation of culture that was embedded in our ancestry and not just our idea of what art is. So I'm going to come to an end. Because the methodology with which we ask the questions and the frameworks and all of those things are as important as the work that we produce. This image, I took this photo. A few years ago, I was in Brazil for a project, and we hiked for about 4 hours to get to this beautiful place. And before I could get in the water, I was with indigenous people, before I could get in the water, they said, you have to ask the water's permission to get into the body of water. And if you are in a bad mood, you cannot get into the water because you can contaminate it. I understand that. I have my favorite dishes I love cooking. If I'm in a bad mood, it's not going to be great. And the reason I'm sharing this is because we talk about consent when we're talking about water and land and all these things. We need to also talk about consent with ideas, with knowledge, with wisdom, with where these things originate. Because that is part of the cultural narrative. That is part of how we are going to start changing those things. And that's how we also recognize that we are part of the problem. Consent is a big thing for all of us to really embody and embrace. Because I realized that my question of what type of ancestor do I want to be initially was still framed in human flourishing before planetary flourishing. And that's a problem. And so now, when we are talking about culture, when we're talking about all of these things, we have to put planetary flourishing first. So the last thing I want to say as a provocation is, if you now replace every time I've said culture in this talk, if you replace that word with technology and AI, that's where we are now. Thank you.
Our final speaker in the panel is Dr. Louis Akenji, who is the executive director of the Hot or Cool Institute. The Hot or Cool Institute is a public interest think tank with a mission to challenge the status quo, supporting people and organizations to reimagine what is possible and thereby create systemic change. He is also co-chair of the Club of Rome Task Force on Materials and Consumption.
Thank you so So I didn't know the title to this presentation. I also was, for those of you that know me, I use a lot of data when I present, but I heard that there's going to be fantastic artists here, so I thought I could fake it till I make it. And what I decided to do was to show you pictures. I've lived in at least 8 countries for at least a year, and I thought I could show you some of the stories I've collected along the way. This picture is the one to the left. I went to a funeral, and everyone was so happy and celebrating and dancing. I asked, what's going on? And they said, well, we're now happy that there's one more ancestor who is looking over us, right? And to the right is in Budapest. I was just walking past the chain bridge, and this ballerina was doing her thing. I don't know what. What you're looking to the left here is GIZ was building. These women have to walk about 1 kilometer to get drinking water, and GIZ was building a pump, and it kept getting destroyed. When I asked them what is going on, and the women said, walking from here to get the water and back is the only time we escape from our husbands, and we can gossip about them. So, yeah, don't do that. This tree, I lived in this house with this man who would get up every morning and religiously go down and pee under this tree. One morning, the wife just got really pissed off, stop doing that, and he said, well, have you ever asked the rain why it keeps falling? Right? I don't know, forget about the little lady there, she's just being normal. Well, I never ask these women questions. There's just something stunning about them, which I thought every country has a sense of beauty. Little things and practices which we have across different communities that say we're all the same thing. But little everyday practices that together form cultures of who we are. Little behaviors that make patterns in us and sort of codify what larger society is. And I would dare say our challenge is to look at these practices, to look at these behaviors, to look at these social norms that we have and ask, how do we codify them in a way that translates to sustainability, to a better world, whatever it is that you pick from these things, right? It is the reason why I thought this was actually my cheat code to get into the point that we really do need storytellers. We need artists to give us a better picture because something horrible has happened to the research and work on sustainability. It's been left in the hands of scientists. Scientists are not good communicators, which is one of the reasons why we're stuck where we are right now. And one thing I tell my colleague, whether or not you know it, and I think that's for most of us, we are in a competition to shape the future. That's our task. That's our mandate. The question then is, who are we in a competition with? We're in a competition with people who think millions of years of geology should end up in their pockets. We are in a competition with people who think they have a right to others' bodies and what they should do with it. We are in a competition with people who think one part of the world is there to serve them. We're in a competition with people who think our data is fair game and they can do whatever they want with it. And the green heart you and I see here, sometimes we express our love in very violent ways. This is the competition we're failing. So I will show you why I use the word failing very deliberately, because if we're not aware of this mandate, we will keep bungling it, right? But I wanted to show something else. The role of institutions, formal and informal. I've shown pictures of different cultures, different societies, different communities. A lot of how we behave, what gives us permission to act in one way or another, whether it's the law or it's just your grandmother looking over your shoulder, is because a lot of this is codified into institutions, into frameworks, principles, norms, systems of provisioning that guide us, railroad us, provide path dependencies. But you can think of actors in any way you want to, because these institutions shape the behaviors of actors. Take the tech bros if you want. What is the interest, what is the stake that someone has as far as an issue is involved? What instruments do they use? Is it that they own media channels? Is it that they're buying up all the lands in other places? And how much influence do they have? Is it influence on the political system in other parts of society? Whatever action, when you aggregate this, whatever action it is that they take results in certain impacts. Positive or negative, it's immaterial, but it does have impact. And in the case of what we're talking today, it's an impact on society and the environment. Pay attention to the role of institution and how it legitimizes This is why we cannot avoid talking about institutions and power. Because a lot of what we think of as cultures, a lot of what is acceptable or not acceptable, it's both a cultivation of individual actions and collective everyday behaviors, and an imposition of power in one form or another. And avoiding this leads to a picture where we are now. I call it false friends in a climate emergency. And when you see C4, it's what I call corporate capture of climate solutions, of climate change solutions. These are solutions which cannot scale to meet everyone's needs, so they just end up as dividends in a few individuals' pockets. These are so-called solutions that are perpetuating the same economic system that is problematic, consumerism. These are so-called solutions that do not recognize the urgency and they're just playing around the periphery. They are so-called solutions that seem to be quite meaningful. Pay attention to the last one. They seem to be the good thing, the right thing to do, but they just delay meaningful action while things keep getting worse, right? Who are our false friends? Eco-labels were a really good idea in the 1980s and 70s. It's way too late to depend on this. It's what I call consumer scapegoatism. We're putting undue pressure in spaces where there's not enough agency to articulate change. This is the new Trojan horse. We have a problem with cars, period. Our translation is to get EVs. There are still cars, surprise, surprise. The problem doesn't go away. This is new forms we find of colonialism around the world. We keep doing the same thing we do, and we ask other people to bear the burden transfer mechanisms. This is the license to greenwash which our governments, our institutions are giving private corporations to perpetuate the same system that we have right now. And the one thing that these are my colleagues and former colleagues, that it breaks my heart, is spaces where we think we have dialogue, where we think we're making meaningful reform, but every year it keeps getting worse. If we do not address our institutions, if we do not bring institutions and culture, this is the landscape that we are looking at. And this is the landscape that is driving us down, right? False friends. But I wanted to end with a little bit. In almost every context, almost every culture, almost every space, we found ways of codifying centuries of behavior, of celebrating the best things that are in us. We really can still revisit that. So, thanks.
Can someone clarify how much time we have left on the panel? I've sort of lost track of the hour. I'm sorry, I know my role here is to keep track of the hour. We've got 30 minutes? Okay, so why don't we have a conversation among us, and then I'll open it up to questions from the audience. It strikes me that one thing that I've heard each of you say in a slightly different way is how much the articulations of what we think we want as for climate solutions, as culture makers, as people in the climate movement, actually inadvertently end up reproducing the culture of domination, the culture of consumption, the culture of inequality, of exploitation that is producing our ecological crisis. So if each of you could, you've all spoken about this a little bit more, but if you could try to speak to what you heard in another talk on this panel in that respect and come into dialogue with each other on that question, I think that would be really valuable for me, because, we've heard about institutions, we've heard about art making, and we've heard about culture making. So perhaps if the people who spoke about art making and culture making could address institutions and vice versa, we could start there. Louis, would you like to start, perhaps?
Yeah, I could go. One thing that struck me is what Ada said. We're asking our cultures to do the things that they can't or something. This is a terrible paraphrasing of something really beautiful that you said. And it hit me that a lot of what we think of as culture, culture is on one hand a very liberating thing in that it gives identity, it gives sense of expression, but it's also a dictatorship in that it requires a certain conformity with a larger. And a dictatorship is not always in a bad way. So there's that fluidity between the individual and the sort of broad whole. It then asks to me, when I look at issues around climate change, when we talk about the urgency, which Indy made really clear yesterday, it asks the question, what sort of institutional mechanism recognizes this urgency and an inability to handhold every individual and acknowledges that there's needing to be some kind of a much stronger response that might not be at a very individual level? And how do you do that? Is that breaking away from what is one of our core tenets, being democratic, or whatever you would choose to call it? Or do we, as the artist so very eloquently indicated with all the yellow papers these days, you do an open exploration where there might be many more possibilities than primitive scientists like me have managed to configure, right? So there's a whole lot of questions that this exposes that I do not think I have a capacity or a methodology to explore, but which I think needs to be opened up.
One of the things that came to mind just as you were speaking is I define my role as an artist as one to create pauses, to create moments of silence. And I feel that I remind myself that organizations are made of individuals and humans within that. And many of these organizations feel that they are creating cultures or communities. But what they're also doing are creating these factories. Somebody mentioned, so in somebody's presentation, they mentioned the use of war, the language of war. And that perpetuates the same thing. It holds them to this idea of its efficiency. We have to go faster. We have to do all these things. And so there is a lack of space for people to stop, to pause, to slow down, to reflect. Sorry, the fly just went behind my glasses. And suddenly there was a blur. I'm like, oh my God, I'm going blind. My journey here was, on Monday, I was in Munich and I was speaking at Alines, one of the sponsors. I was speaking, Alines. Yeah, I was speaking at their organization about the pause. And one of the things that really happened in those conversations is suddenly they're realizing we don't create spaces for pauses for us to even think about anything outside of there. And I feel that that's also part of what's perpetuating the myth of the ego, the stereotypes, all of those things. And I don't even know if that's addressing your question or what you were saying, but it's what came to mind when you were speaking, that we're in this hyper, we have to keep going, we have to keep producing. We need to understand agentic AI. We need to understand all of these things, and we need to bring them into our organization without thinking about the long-term implication, not just externally, but also internally on the humans within those businesses. Because there are so many people now who want to step off the hamster wheel. They want to do different. But they've got the responsibilities of market share, blah, 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 that they don't know how to do it. And I feel that when an organization begins to really remember and deep listen to what culture is, it creates an opportunity for care and for consideration and reflection.
Yeah, I mean, maybe building on that, it's what I think some of the misperceptions that we're kind of speaking to is that culture is trying to get people to do something, create the agency or get politicians to do something. And, maybe that's part of it, but actually it's about seeing the world differently or feeling things differently is what you're talking about.
From doing to being.
Exactly, and being in it. And then that being in it and that feeling it, and sometimes feeling that, or seeing different ways of being, what that does is it creates spaces for permission, right? And it actually creates spaces for politicians to be able to do what they can do. It gives permission for us to do different things differently. But But I think it's realizing we're kind of in an emperor's new clothes moment, aren't we? Does everyone know the culture reference point that I'm talking about? The emperor's new clothes, like an old story, right? In which it becomes very apparent that the imperial emperor is naked, his beautiful clothes are fake. And I feel that's the moment we're in, right? The imperial system is creaking. The imperial system is now, it's becoming obvious to a child that the imperial system is no longer delivering the lie of progress, the promise of betterment. And in that moment, when the empire's faltering, trying to hold on, it's an incredibly rich space for imagining other ways of being. And in a way, the tech kind of rollout of the conversation at the moment, exactly as you said, it's exactly the same narrative playbook as the fossil fuel industry. It's here, you have to get with the program, here it is, you've got to come with it, and if you stand against this tsunami of technology, you're a crazy woman. But actually, the truth of it is that's one type of AI. It's a very imperial model of AI. Yeah. It's not the only one. And this is the real sort of cultivation space that I think culture can bring. What do you think?
I completely agree, and I want to add that we're in a time where, as I said, we don't necessarily understand the consciousness of who has created the AIs and the platforms that we're using. However, there are indigenous LLMs. There are many indigenous languages have not been spoken. They're oral, not written. So when you think about ChatGPT and all these things that scrape from all over the place, there is also an exclusion of culture. But what we have is we're in a time where everybody's talking about large language models. They don't have to be large. They don't have to. One of the things that's just happened in England is that in order for AI to get faster, bigger, what have you, you need bigger data storage facilities. Many of those data storage facilities, the way that they're funded is that the banks that give loans. And the banks have realized, suddenly many of the UK banks have realized that the loans are too big and it's too risky. So they've suddenly started to pull loans for data centers. Because as the AI gets faster and faster, it impacts the climate and the planet more and harder and faster and all these things. One of my own personal kind of difficulties is I understand this. I understand the impact that AI is having on the planet, on mental health, on well-being, and all of these things. Can I claim to be a climate activist and use social media? Because every time I ask someone to like something, I'm undoing everything I stand for. And that's the thing. Those are the conversations that we also need to have as artists, as cultural commentators, as all of these things.
I think that might open up the conversation about whether we use the proverbial master's tools to dismantle the master's house or not, and to what degree, and to what end. But I want to ask something sort of from left field before I open this up to the audience, which is, we've heard a lot today about culture, however you want to define it, both as sort of what entraps us in the present, but what helps us imagine better futures, more livable and sustainable futures. But what I want to discuss also at this conference, if not on this panel, is what about grief and rage and fear? And what about opening up culture for those experiences, those affects, those emotions that very often people feel they must hold alone when they encounter the climate crisis or when they go deep with the climate crisis? And part of what I've found in my own work, and is certainly among the climate movement in the United States, is that people burn out simply because there is no culture in the broadest sense of the term, in the most multifarious sense of the term, for people to experience the encounter with climate change without actually even being punished for it, for their feelings, and being sort of exiled from mainstream norms, or told that they're hippies, or they're strange, or they're anti-capitalist, or they're whatever. So can we also please have a conversation about creating cultures of grief, of alienation, of rage, of terror, of futility, making space for all of those things so they can be socialized and people do not have to go through them alone. Isn't that also a form of political transformation and a form of political resistance?
Yeah. I mean, I think, so if you think about when Ella put on the screen, the process of change we're in, you've got to kind of dismantle the old and build the new. At the moment, we're in that space in between, right? And in that, you have different roles to play. The illuminators that can show the way we're going, that can show through the mountain pass. It's going to be difficult. The journey's going to be tough. But we're going to get to the other side and it's going to be better. You need all of those. You need the process of grief of the world you're leaving behind and the world that you're leaving behind and the way of being and the lives we've lived and the loss that comes with it. You need space for that. And you need people with you to journey through the difficult times. And you need the visionaries to get you through. And I think sometimes we forget all of those are part of our cultural space making. But you might have thoughts on this.
So I'm also chair of Mental Health First Aid England. We train people to be mental health and suicide first aiders. I've been chair for 6 years now. We have over 120,000 members. And in 2023, we trained our millionth person. And I always get goosebumps. And one of the things that I did when I joined is I first talked about that we have to look at our language. And we have to also look at what we put as our foundations. And for me, climate, not sustainability, because sustain means to maintain the same. And if we're declining, why are we still talking about sustain? Regeneration. But for me, I've just joined. I'm part of Earth Percent. I sit on the Earth Percent committee. Kathy, thank you. I donate 1% of all earnings to 1% for the planet. I've just joined Chapter Zero, which is for non-executive directors to look at how you put climate as a fundamental foundation of who you are and how you operate. And I feel that's the conversation about how you change things and help people to understand they're not alone. Because during the pandemic, so I became chair at the start of the pandemic. MHFA, Mental Health First Aid England, is part of an Australian organisation. And during the pandemic, when Australia also had the forest fires, they did some research and they discovered that people were more concerned about the forest fires and climate than they were about COVID. That tells you everything. And so for me, that's how you start to make the cultural change and help people know they're not alone, because it becomes fundamental to the governance, the structure, the resources, everything that you are as an organization. And it's not a checklist, because to me, it should be that it's like diversity. You shouldn't have to talk about it. It shouldn't have to be a checklist. It shouldn't have to be, we're going to do this and, we're doing a campaign. We need to make sure we've got one black face, one brown face. We shouldn't have to be at that space. And climate, and not just climate, ecological decline. Mm-hmm. Climate is one aspect of that. Needs to be at the center of it. I'm going to stop talking.
Lewis, did you want to add something to this?
I was just thinking, almost every culture, at least cultures that have spanned a long time, have elements for grief and different outlets for all these emotions. And they're still present where we are now. The problem that I see here is that the norms and the practices that we've chosen to institutionalize and codify are those that come from the more rational perspectives of our everyday existence. We've left an understanding, a diagnosis, and recommendations for the ecological decay that we face in the hands of very rationally constructed instruments and methods. Scientists, policymakers, and tech gods, and so on. This is one of the problems, that once you think of when you ascribe a technical quality to the problem, it's CO2 emissions, it's physically cutting down of trees. When you do not see the intangible communities around it, people that enjoy or the beauty of nature, and you ascribe just the technical values, the tendency is to bring technical or technologically adapted solutions or economistic solutions to it. It undermines almost everything else, including the sort of values that you're talking about. I give you a quick story around this, if you would. you would notice quite many scientists are either buying farms if they can afford it and escaping there, or they're getting depressed and looking for doctors. So we produce a report, 1.5 degree lifestyles, and after this report, each time it's produced, you can tell the shock on the faces of my colleagues in the office. It's almost like they've seen zombies. They can't. You really do see it, and it's horrifying to see, and because it's bare bones contact with the reality of what is out there, and you have to ask the question: how do you deal with this? Then we translate what we see there in all our stress and distress and depression and frustration to policymakers who are stressed and distressed and trying to win elections and every day cooking different lies to tell. These are the groups that we're asking to formulate new institutions and cultures for us tomorrow. We are going to be a broken people if we do not break this cycle, right? The question is, how do we do that? It's something which, as if you've seen anything I've shown, I'm not capable of, so. Yeah.
Well, there's a whole room full of
Can I
people.
say one thing? So one thing that I'm advocating for is that corporates have an artist in residence. So it's something that I've been speaking to a lot of corporations about, and it's not just about producing beautiful works of art, but you need an artist in residence who sits on your board, who has buy-in power, who has budget power, who has decision-making power, because we as artists understand the nuances of life, of society, of all of those things. And when I first started speaking about it, people were like, but now the idea of pitching yourself to a corporate as an artist futurist in residence means that there is an opportunity to change storytelling, narratives, thinking, all of those perspectives from the inside.
Do we have time for questions? I keep losing track of it. All right. Would you like to ask a question?
Thank you very much. Do I have to turn this on? I was very happy that Louis and Ada pointed out or mentioned nature, because I think I'm a scientist for 40 years now. I collect data, I analyze data, I read scientific papers, I write scientific papers. And after 40 years, unfortunately, I have to realize that data and facts don't change don't move people enough to change what they are doing. On the other side, everyone has an emotional connection to nature. And this is, for example, what I think it's very, very important that we talk about nature. Nobody has an emotional connection to CO2 or 1.5 degrees. So, but everyone, if I attend meetings and then I can talk about the science and the numbers, everybody's like, oh, terrible, terrible. And then I talk about how I visited habituated mountain gorillas in Rwanda, or the Great Migration in the Serengeti, and everybody's like, oh yeah, and I went to the Alps, and I went to the North Sea, and blah, 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 what I've seen. And I think this is something where definitely art can help us a lot. That my question is, do you agree? And how do we get? Yes. and how do we actually? I don't want to force you to change the name of your organizations, but in a way, I think we need to talk much more about nature. Climate is, in a way, it's framed in a bad way, and it's not an emotional thing. And as a scientist, again, unfortunately, I had realized the facts don't change.
Lucy, do you agree that we need to talk more about nature?
Yes. I mean, there's a whole nother talk that, we could do, isn't there, about this? And in fact, when I set up Climate Spring, I really didn't want to call it Climate Spring for this reason, because I really think we're talking about from extractivism or colonization to regeneration, right? And climate is one of the symptoms, along with biodiversity loss, along with inequality, right? It's all the symptoms of the problem. But actually the advice we had, because we work with the media, the entertainment industry, with artists, they wanted to know we were the people working on culture and actually, for climate, for a lot of people, not experts in the space, people have started to shorthand climate for nature, climate for other things. So it's it's become a bit of a shorthand for something, but I absolutely agree, it's just one of the symptoms of the problem. But the other thing is the framing problem of climate that we've talked about a lot from Technofix gives you the solution, which is don't change the system, just clean out the system, switch fossil fuels for renewables, same system, where we know that's not going to really get to the root of the problem. So absolutely, I think we'd agree with that. I think there is a whole language question, and we've just been doing a piece of work with, we're working with, we've got over 100 projects now, I should have said, that's quite exciting, over 100 projects now with 100 production companies, all in development and production, with this lens applied to them. And we're working with them to try and change some of the language around this, because, you get tripped up, I think, sometimes, don't we, in some of the poverty of language. But
Indeed you do. And with that, I will say thank you so much to my brilliant panelists. I thought this was really inspiring and fascinating, and I look forward to more conversations over the next day and a half. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.